Welcome to the Urbanist virtual panel on the 2024 Washington State Legislative Session. I'm Crystal Fincher, and I'm a political consultant, board member of the Urbanist, and host of the Hacks and Wonks podcast. At the Urbanist, our vision is that the Puget Sound region's built environment and social systems support thriving, healthy, sustainable, and just communities. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ryan Packer and Jazmine Smith to break down what happened in the 2024 legislative session. We're excited to be able to stream this live on Zoom within 48 hours. It will be posted on the event page at theurbanist.org. Tonight, we'll be covering the bills that did and didn't pass during the session, discuss why the session played out as it did and what comes next, then conclude with a brief question and answer session. Our esteemed panelists for this evening are Ryan Packer. Ryan lives in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle, writing for the Urbanist since 2015. They were hired in 2024 as the organization's first full-time reporter and primarily cover housing, transportation, and other land use issues. You're most likely to see them on transit riding light rail between Capitol Hill and Pioneer Square. And Jazmine Smith. Jazmine is a political hack and policy wonk who won't shut up about niche local, statewide politics, bikes, bus lanes, and building more housing. She's vice chair to the Urbanist Election Committee and has been serving on the Queen Anne Community Council as a board member and formerly transportation co-chair, and serves on the Uptown Land Use Review Committee. She's an ardent renter in Lower Queen Anne and e-bikes around town whenever she doesn't just take the bus or train. Jazmine loves being an organizer and will relationally organize you into caring about things. We'll begin by talking about how the session started and then the bills that passed. So Ryan, what were the expectations leading into this session?
Thanks, Crystal. It's really great to be here. By the way, the expectations for this session were pretty big. 2023 was a pretty big session. The state passed a missing middle housing bill and a bunch of other pretty significant housing related legislation. And there was a lot of hope that the momentum from that was going to be able to carry forward into 2024. But there were some pretty significant headwinds that were kind of pushing against that. Primarily the short session. It's significantly less time to pass bills than in a odd year session, and then the fact that legislative elections are coming up this fall, and everyone's kind of eyeing the political calendar. And then finally, local governments were kind of pushing against any changes because the state's biggest counties had to update their comprehensive plans, which you are likely hearing about in your city right now, by the end of this year. And so they were very reluctant to kind of have more burdens added onto them during this spring. And so those were kind of the headwinds, but there was still a lot of expectation that we were going to be able to kind of do some big wins following 2023.
Absolutely.
Sort of being dubbed the year of housing 2.0.
Definitely. So the first bill that we'll discuss that did pass, this is good news, is House Bill 1998, sponsored by Representative Mia Gregerson, which paves the way for co-living housing, also referred to as single room occupancy or microhousing. Ryan, what does this legislation do?
So it's pretty big. It legalizes, like you said, single room occupancy kind of housing where a building may not have an individual kitchen for every single living unit, and there's kind of shared facilities. Obviously, these types of buildings were kind of very popular, kind of the end of the 19th century going into the 20th century. But they were kind of banned around the 60s and 70s around a lot of fire concerns. Obviously, fire codes are very different now. A lot of those concerns were kind of couching other, prejudices against the types of people who would live in these buildings. We saw kind of a little bit of a boom in the sort of micro apartment construction, of the past over 15 years ago in Seattle. But there was a backlash to that as well. And so this bill kind of stopped cities from being able to ban this. It was originally applying everywhere. That was scaled back to everywhere that 6 units or more are permitted. So you're not going to see a micro unit SRO popping up in Medina, but um, it's a big change in terms of being able to allow these sort of uh, more impactful, lower cost units. It's kind of the only type of market rate housing that gets anywhere close to sort of, something that's kind of affordable for somebody living on a fairly modest income. And so um, it's kind of a big win in terms of the diversity of housing stock. But ultimately, I think the micro unit bill is kind of going to be the exception that proves the rule in terms of whether we actually did have a year of housing 2.0.
That makes sense. So now Senate Bill 6015, sponsored by Senator Sharon Shoemake, which hopes to lower the cost of parking mandates, also passed. Jasmine, why are parking mandates costly and how does this impact them?
Parking mandates are another requirement that adds on to the cost of building housing. So when a developer is wanting to put in apartments at the top of Queen Anne, and we're saying that they need to have X amount of parking units, regardless of the actual need for the people that are going to live there, then it adds costs to the building, which adds costs to the future renters, which then prices them out down the line when there's that higher barrier to enter. And it also functions in a sort of induced demand sort of way that sometimes just gets spurred on by what we foresee and predict and propose the lifestyle of one onto everyone else. So when you hear homeowners in Queen Anne that are like, well, I need 2 parking spots for both people in my as like the head of households to have cars. Every couple that's living in a studio needs to have a car. And so why wouldn't this apartment building have two parking spots for every unit? That's not enough. Then that's not taking into account the actual people that are going to be living there. And when we have transit rich environments where people like me, I don't need to have a car, and not everyone in our building needs to have a car or a parking space. Ryan?
Yeah, so this is an interesting bill. And so it's a little bit of parking is kind of the third rail of local government issues at the Washington legislature. Obviously, we've seen high profile attempts in other states to kind of abolish parking minimums overall. There was a bill recently introduced in Minnesota that would do just that. Those bills have traditionally not done very well in the Washington legislature, mostly due to government lobbying. And so this bill is kind of like saying, okay, we're not gonna ban minimums, but what if all the parking spaces aren't gold plated? I think is how the bill sponsor described it, which is like if you have a long narrow strip where you can fit 2 cars in there, one of them is blocking the other, but that can still count as 2 parking spaces. You don't have to have a full egress, and then you can kind of have a way to build something on a lot where you might not normally have before been able to because of those parking requirements. And so it's kind of trying to adapt the paper requirements to what actually happens in real life. And so obviously it's not what urbanists want in terms of you shouldn't have to require anyone to build a parking spot, but it's kind of meeting someone. I won't even say halfway. It's a little bit of a win in terms of not having to do everything that you normally have to do require parking.
Yeah, and hopefully also paves the way for safer streets, and that it also has a provision that says if a locality can prove that parking minimums are dangerous to pedestrians or bicyclists in an area, that they can be able to forego them in that situation. Also want to talk about House Bill 2071, sponsored by Representative Davina Dewar, which lays the groundwork for some future progress. Brian, how does this bill seek to make building missing middle housing more affordable?
Yeah, and so this is a little bit of a much lower profile changes. than something like the microhousing or the missing middle bill. It's kind of all these kind of hidden requirements that get added onto building housing. And so this is asking the Building Code Council for to study some recommended changes. One of them is adding the basically expanding the definition of a residential code. So currently, multifamily buildings in Washington actually come under the commercial building code. And so even if they're a mixed use apartment building. And so that is a much more stringent sort of, requirement in terms of how you're building your building. And so it's asking the building code council to basically say, what if we have a 6-unit building? Can that become part of the residential code? And to help reduce costs for these missing middle housing types that we want to see in our neighborhoods, but the cost just doesn't pencil when you have to, if you could build a large single family home under the residential building code, but if you have 4 or 6 units, you would have to go to commercial. And so there's just a prohibitive cost associated with that. This bill had some other provisions that were kind of removed through the process, I'll say, in the state Senate side, which is kind of the saucer that cools the coffee here. Maybe we don't want our coffee that cold, but that's the process that we have. And so there was another provision that actually was going to make it easier to build passive house, which is sort of the very energy efficient building types that urbanists love in terms of having higher insulation, more insulation, kind of more, but those also require kind of deviating from the normal requirements that a regular building might have. That was stripped away. There's another provision that I was really excited about that actually kind of got rid of this conflict that also comes up when you talk about trees and parking. And so it said that if you have a conflict between your local minimum parking requirements and tree retention, so basically if adding parking to your lot would require you to remove some very nice trees that would otherwise be preserved, then the trees win. And so that provision was actually also removed by the Senate Local Government Committee, but it was actually put back in the bill we just referenced, the parking bill, on the House side. So it's a little bit of a parliamentary maneuvering that I was pretty impressed with. I think that would be called the Hail Mary of this session in terms of pulling something out of one bill and putting it right back in another. Makes perfect sense in both, honestly. But I just wanted to tip my hat to Representative Davina Dewar, our favorite legislator from Bothell.
Absolutely. Another bill that passed this session is House Bill 2081, sponsored by Representative Brandy Donaghy from the 44th Legislative District, which expands where automated traffic safety cameras can be used. So what currently happens with automated camera enforcement, and how does this bill expand on that, Jazmine?
Well, this bill expands on a pilot program. First of all, it's the cities that have populations over 500,000 permits traffic cameras to be used at certain locations. And it goes even further and now authorizes automatic traffic safety cameras to detect speed violations on state routes within city limits that are classified as city streets, and then also in work zones on city streets and on county roads. It also authorizes the traffic cameras to be used to detect public transportation only lane violations, which will be really helpful with all of our bus lanes in Seattle and actually having people understand that this is for buses and that they are not in fact a bus. It would also allow traffic cameras to be used as part of the public transportation vehicle mounted system within a county that has over 1.5 million residents, and authorizes civilian employees who work for law enforcement agencies or local public works or transportation departments and who meet training certifications. So it doesn't just keep this in policing. And what we've seen time and time again is that traffic cameras do work when we're holding people accountable, that slow speeds do make sure that people are more safe, that it reduces the biases of speed traps in targeted areas, and that we can take this sort of function away from the police department as well.
That makes sense. What is your view of this bill, Ryan, and what impacts this will have?
Yeah, so traditionally in Washington, speed and sort of automatic traffic cameras have been fairly limited to red lights and immediately around schools. The Move Ahead Washington package in 2022, which funded a large number of transportation projects, also kind of dramatically expanded this to include hospital zones, parks, and intersections where there are a lot of crashes happening, pedestrian safety issues. But we weren't really seeing a whole lot of cities adopting that. And so this actually kind of cleans it up a little bit and makes there more of an incentive. But it also kind of pushes the incentives in one direction, which is away from using cameras as a full revenue generator. And so it caps the total on normal most camera tickets, and then allows that to be doubled for school zones, so around $150 to $300. And then, but if you have a camera under this program in place for more than 4 years, you're required to kick back a quarter of that amount to the state. And so you take a little bit of a hit if you keep a camera in place for a long time. Maybe you have a speed trap of some kind that you're not using the funds generated from the camera to fix because you like that. It's trying to kind of push that away and actually use the cameras in a way that actively improves safety.
That makes sense. Now we'll discuss the bills that did not pass. This, as you said before, was a session that was initially billed as the Year of Housing 2.0, but it did not quite end up living up to that title. The Rent Stabilization Bill, House Bill 2114, sponsored by Representative Emily Alvarado and Senator Yasmin Trudeau, was one of the highest profile bills of the session. It passed the state house, but then died in our state Senate. Jazmine, what is the rent stabilization? What is rent stabilization before we even get to the bill, and why is it necessary?
Yeah, rent stabilization isn't rent control. It gives all of us something that we can expect. It gives us as renters a way to know that we won't have our rent jacked up an exorbitant amount, and that we'll be able to plan for inflation, how prices change over time without risking displacement, risking immediately having to figure out where you're going to go because your landlord raised the rent 10%, 20%, which isn't in line with what the market does or what people need or whatnot. What it also would have done is ensure that there were tenant protections statewide. We're doing a lot of tenant protections piecemeal. And so tying in other things like 6 months notice for rent increases, again, with the stability, but then also would have provided resources for landlords as well to know what is going on and how they can better serve the tenants that they have and do things legally. So that was one that we at the Best were really excited about. The Urbanist was really excited about, and we really wanted young people, wanted our communities, wanted renters to be able to not have to worry so much about being displaced, being unsheltered because of how quickly rents have gone up.
Absolutely. Ryan, what was your view of this bill, and what percentage increase would this have limited rent renewals to?
I'm gonna actually phone a friend and ask Jasmine to remind me on that exact figure.
Okay,
It
it was
went up and
7%.
down. Yeah, 7%. Started at 5, was going to be amended to 15, which was way too much in the Senate housing. And then when it went over to the Senate, would have been 7%. Final answer.
Yeah. So this was obviously going to be an uphill battle with basically no Republican support on either chamber. When you have a bill that has no Republican support, it empowers a small group of legislators in the Democratic caucus to be able to block legislation, especially in committee. And so we saw that with in the Senate Ways and Means Committee. When it got to the Senate side, it was a very unusual maneuver where it basically bypassed the Senate Housing Committee, which was fairly unusual. It doesn't happen very often, maybe once every other session or something like that. And so a lot of interest in sort of seeing why the floor leader, Senator Jamie Peterson of Seattle, decided to do that. But by the time I got to the Ways and Means Committee, it was sort of Mark Mullet of Issaquah and Kevin Vandeweghe of the Olympic Peninsula sort of taking the heat for stopping the bill in its tracks, with the chair of the House Housing Committee, Strom Peterson, basically famously saying, "Is there anything I can do, Senator Vandeweghe, to get you to change your position?" He says, "No." That's a good story, but what we don't know is how many people were standing behind Mullet and Vandeweghe in terms of opposing the bill and letting them take the heat for stopping it. And so we have seen sort of opposition to this idea from some more market-oriented urbanists. Senator Shoemake, who's huge advocate for missing middle and density, raised concerns about whether this is going to inhibit new housing supply. I believe there was an amendment that would have extended the new construction exemption from 10 years to 15, but even that was not going to be able to apparently assuage the concerns. So I think we have next year we have a lot of the same people who voted for this in the House kind of going over to the Senate, but I think those concerns are gonna stick around.
Very interesting dynamic there. So next up is the Transit-Oriented Development Bill, HB 2160, sponsored by Representative Julia Reed out of Seattle's 36th Legislative District. What is transit-oriented development, and what was the goal of this bill, Ryan?
So basically, we've done missing middle, which is densifying our residential areas, allowing a little bit more housing, not big apartment buildings. This is sort of seen as the next frontier in terms of allowing more housing options, which is unlocking our areas around our big public transit investments. And so um, the Governor Inslee, has made this his kind of big priority in housing, which is, we're spending all these billions of dollars on light rail, bus rapid transit, even frequent local bus service. We should be allowing more people to live around these stations. And data has shown that they're vastly underutilized areas around a lot of our stations. But the question is how to do it, which stations should be prioritized, how far from them, how big should the buildings go. These are all intensely complicated levers to kind of figure out how to fiddle with. And the trick is you're using a statewide brush, and so you have to look at Seattle, Snohomish County, Pierce County, Clark County around Vancouver. They have a bus rapid transit system. Spokane has the new city line, and so you have to kind of look at all these in the same time. It's very tricky. It's not a missing middle where it's 4 units. Okay, and so in 2023, Senator Marco Lias proposed a TOD bill that applied to a lot of areas. It included light rail, sounder, but also buses that come every 20 minutes for most of the day, which is a lot of areas, and it extended, fairly far on either side of stations. And so And the buildings proposed under that bill were going to be fairly large. It got scaled down, but the real sticking point in the House was whether the buildings that would be allowed under that new bill, under that new zoning framework by the stations, would be required to include affordable units. So if you have a 10-unit building, whether one or two of the units would be required to be rented to someone who is making a lower income, can't afford a market rate apartment in that building. And so that was kind of the big thing that was added on the House side. It caused the bill to fail on the House side. This year, we tried from the House side to start the bill. It originally included that 10% affordability. It also included only rail, so streetcar, light rail, and sounder, as well as bus rapid transit, a quarter mile around bus rapid transit compared to the half mile around rail. And so it's a little bit more scaled down, and the buildings were a little more scaled down too. And so, but the affordability mandate basically proved to be the sticking point again. And so on the Senate side, by the time it got to the Ways and Means Committee again, we saw a lot of opposition to the idea of having a blanket affordability mandate. And it was people like Mark Mollett who kind of took the brunt of this. But once again, it's clear that there is more opposition than just one or two, especially given the margins to get out of the Ways and Means Committee. There's some opposition. And so it's not clear whether or not there's going to be a reconciliation of that idea moving forward.
Makes sense. Now, next is an interesting, more interesting case. We talked about some bills that had no Republican support. This neighborhood cafe bill, which the Urbanist covered in our coverage, it was sponsored by Representative Mark Clicker, a Republican from Walla Walla, and it unanimously passed the House, but died in the Senate. What would this bill have made possible? Go ahead, Ryan.
Sorry. Basically, it was a very simple bill, maybe deceptively simple. Anywhere you have residential uses and you don't have a dead-end street, you should be able to allow a neighborhood cafe. And so, there were very few other parameters. I think the bill that passed the House basically would have required a maximum of 2 parking spaces and allowed cities to limit their local operating hours, but that was about it. And so everyone loved this idea. Everyone wants to see the Volunteer Park Cafe open up in their neighborhood. But in terms of, do you want to, Jazmine, do you want to tell what happened in the Senate?
It just got some amendments on it that turned it into not what we were looking for. And then that, yeah.
Local government lobbyists got a local government lobby. So basically, there were, the Association of Washington Cities kind of got involved and said, oh, everyone loves this, but what if you have 1 million cars converging on a neighborhood cafe in your neighborhood? And what if you sell alcohol there and you have, it became the avalanche of what ifs that there's no evidence that would materialize. And so the Senate side kind of tried to turn it into a bill that lets cities allow this, even though they already can. There was one version that actually might have banned places from the Volunteer Park Cafe, like the Volunteer Park Cafe, from serving alcohol. And so it kind of, nobody really wanted to see it pass by the end, even though everybody loved the idea of the bill at the beginning.
Yeah, it went from something that would have given everyone these great things, everyone what they wanted to see in their neighborhood, their cafes, their uh, neighborhood meeting spaces and whatnot, and then got to a point that it would have harmed the ones that already existed.
It would have. Now, another bill that there was certainly momentum for, that the Urbanist and many others were excited about, was the Even Year Elections Bill, HB 1932, another one sponsored by Representative Mia Gregerson. And this also passed the House and failed in the Senate, seeming to be a big trend here. So Jazmine, why was this bill so important, and what impact would it have on Urbanist priorities?
Yeah, this bill was important because it would have allowed, by the time it made it out of the House committee, it would have allowed cities and towns to make the choice for themselves if they wanted to be able to move their elections to a time when more people are voting. We've seen time and time again that in even years, our voter participation is incredibly higher than in odd years. And we have a really old law in the books that says that you can only have local races in non-legislative years, essentially. So this would have given cities and towns the permission, or permission to choose that for themselves. The original bill started with a mandate that, if you have really, really low voter turnout, under 40% for 4 odd year cycles, then again, you've got to change this. But that was a thought and idea that was very willingly, easily taken out to make it just like a permission to do so bill rather than a mandate. And then when it hit the Senate State Government Committee, it also got some new provisions in it, one of which would have made it so, for example, with the city of Seattle, we could have, if this bill as it passed the House had made it through, we could have done it through like a charter amendment by the people. We could have moved our elections to even year without council getting involved. With the provision that was put in the Senate State Government Committee, then it would have made it so it has to basically pass the legislative body and pass the vote of the people in order to move those elections, which in our current state would have made it so that we wouldn't have been able to have even year elections in Seattle until we had a new administration on the council side, because our council president has come out strongly against even year elections. Then it was mysteriously sent to the Ways and Means Committee, which it didn't have to go through a fiscal committee on the House side. And that's where it died on the last day before fiscal cutoff, along with the rent stabilization bill. It was a double gut punch day.
Double gut punch is a good description of the feeling a lot of us felt at the end of the session with some of these bills not making it through. So now that we've covered some of those bills that did and didn't make it out of session, let's talk about why that happened. So we did hit on that theme, major theme in our discussion. Many of the bills that made great progress, that passed the House, died in the Senate. Why is this happening? There are several senators who are not running for re-election, who are either running for other office like governor or public lands commissioner, or just deciding not to retire. Could the upcoming election change this? Starting with Ryan, what are your thoughts?
It definitely can. As you mentioned, we have some high-profile exits from especially the state Senate side, either due to seeking higher office or just a time to be done. So we got State Senator Mark Mullet, like I mentioned, is running for governor. State Senator Van de Weg is running for Commissioner of Public Lands. State Senator Andy Billig, who's a majority leader, currently majority leader, is leaving. State Senator Sam Hunt. We also have State Senator Patty Cooter, the chair of the Senate Housing Committee, running for Insurance Commissioner. I'm sure I'm forgetting someone. So we have a lot of turnover in the Senate, which only has 49 seats. And so we have a fairly big percentage of people leaving. We're getting a, shouldn't say that. We may be getting a massive housing advocate running for state Senate to replace Sam Hunt. Jessica Bateman, the architect of the missing middle bill, has announced to run for her seat. I haven't seen anyone else who may be able to pose a strong challenge for her, but it's possible. But to be a formidable force on the Senate side for housing reform. But I think I just want to underline something that I mentioned before, which is sort of this fact that when you have these proposals that are not super bipartisan, they're very polarized. We kind of are empowering a very small subset of conservative, or more conservative Democrats to be able to block legislation than a proposal that is kind of more bipartisan. And it's not clear yet who the kind of new Mark Mullet, the new Van de Weg will be, but I think it's a little premature to kind of celebrate and say, oh, well, this person has been blocking everything for years and now they're gone, so everything is going to move smoothly again. It's not really how the Senate is designed, and the short session, especially in 2024, running up to the election, I was just kind of pulling up the deadlines. Basically, the session started on January 8th. They have until the 31st. So they have, less than 3 weeks to get your first hurdle passed. It's an incredibly hard thing to do.
It is a hard thing to do with a lot of competing priorities and a limited amount of time. What are your thoughts, Jazmine?
Yeah, I think that the way that the legislature is structured makes it really challenging for the people that we want to see in these roles. Be able to, first of all, run and take it on in the first place, and then also stay. We saw a lot of turnover in recent sessions, and so it's two-pronged of wanting to ensure that the people who are supporting our policies, that are supporting our wants and needs for our communities and the future of Washington, are able to maintain and have a future in the legislature and build up the I guess like institutional power in a sense to be leading the conversations. And so I do think it's also important to be able to see who are those new people that are going to crop up and in say Ways and Means, where they were hiding behind Mullet and Van de Wey and whatnot before, but now seeing where people stand more that they weren't necessarily sharing before. And I think that it's one of those things where we need to have advocates, people in our communities standing with and standing in support of our legislators so that they can say, my constituents want us to have rent stabilization. My constituents can't stay in the 36th or the 43rd because prices are going up too high. My constituents have been reaching out to me about these issues, and I'm going to stand with them and be loud, be heard, and work together.
Absolutely. I'll just add one additional note on potential moves to the Senate that may be helpful for housing. We talked about a couple of few bills, I think, that were sponsored by Representative Mia Gregerson of the 33rd Legislative District. Senator Karen Kaiser of the 33rd is going to be stepping down. later this year opening up an appointment process for that seat that both the representatives for that seat, Mia Gregerson and Tina Orwell, have expressed interest in. So that's going to be very interesting to follow and see how that turns out. Are there any other impacts, I guess, any other things that you saw impacted the way this session unfolded, Ryan?
I think that the impact of local government lobbying can't really be understated in terms of last year. I think there was some time to regroup since the end of the 2023 session, and sort of the significant wins that were made in that session. And I think local government lobbying was a lot more organized this year and was able to make some big wins and be able to get their priorities in order. And so I definitely want to underscore sort of the impact that Organization of Washington Cities, they were basically able to get a lot of what they were aiming to accomplish. A city like a tiny city like Clyde Hill, which didn't even have a lobbyist, I don't think, in 2023. They basically decided to collaborate with some cities around them, Medina, Beaux-Arts, and get a new lobbyist this year. And while we can't infer 100% causation in terms of everything that they wanted to happen, but basically all the bills that they were tracking and concerned about didn't make it through.
I think another thing that had a impact on session was the initiatives, so the 6 initiatives statewide, and how that impacted both budget conversations and what new things or even old things legislators were willing to take on. And it also ended up serving as some excuses as well for things being deprioritized.
Now, looking forward to what's next, what's coming up, and into next session, I want to start with a conversation about initiatives, but the 3 initiatives that are going to wind up on the November ballot. They're being championed by hedge fund manager and GOP mega donor Brian Haywood and the chair of the Washington State Republican Party, Jim Walsh. Initiative 2109 would repeal the capital gains excise tax. Initiative 2117 would repeal the Climate Commitment Act, which was passed in 2021. And Initiative 2124 would allow basically employees to opt out of the state's long-term care plan known as Washington Cares. What impact could any of these bills have on urbanist priorities?
I am probably more prepared to talk about the CCA, and I'll probably let Jazmine talk about capital gains. But the effect of the repeal of the CCA it can't be understated. It is massive, both to a direct climate impact perspective, which is the purpose of the legislation, and to the revenue of the state. And so, the Climate Commitment Act dollars, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars per biennium. It goes to things that urbanists like, for the most part. Bike and pedestrian infrastructure, electrifying ferries, basically, all these, environmentally friendly. Obviously, we can talk about EV charging and all that, but on the whole, we all want these things to be spent on. There's been a lot of I think misdirection around what the impact of repealing the CCA would be. We've seen the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee, Mark Elias, get lambasted on Twitter for suggesting that some transportation projects that are funded by gas tax would get reassessed if the CCA was repealed. And that's 100% accurate, because if the CCA was repealed, we still need to fund climate action. We still need to fund electrification of ferries and bike and pedestrian infrastructure. And so we're going to have to look everywhere we can to get those dollars to be able to fund those things. We're not going to suddenly decide that the only thing that we do with our transportation budget is expand highways, which is obviously what a large part of our current gas tax goes toward. We're not going to just decide, oh, we don't need those bike and pedestrian grants. We don't need free fare, a fare-free transit in the entire state for kids. We don't need that. We'll just go back to the old status quo. That's not what's going to happen. And there's going to be a full reprioritization of the entire transportation budget, and which is already under a lot of stress because gas tax revenues are still under what they were supposed to be.
And Jazmine, what do you think about the repeal of the capital gains tax?
Yeah, the capital gains tax has been widely successful for collecting dollars for our kids, for childcare, for early education, and we also found that it's impacting less people than we thought it would. It's a small number of people, but it's collecting even more money in capital or in revenue than we anticipated. And there's really no reason to stop funding, collecting funding for kids. There's no real impact on most people in Washington besides the real impact that having money for our education, for our youth is going to have. And we're at a time when our schools, our childcare is under a huge amount of financial stress. Parents are paying more for their kids to go to preschool than they are for them to go to higher education. And this is having a huge impact on families. Our K through 12 schools are underfunded, and it will also have a chilling effect on other progressive revenue options that we have. So the wealth tax that we've been working on for years already has taken that narrative hit that on the whole conversation of, well, if we can't do capital gains, then what about the wealth tax? We can't even think about that. So yeah, we need every dollar that we can get, and cutting or rejecting capital gains will not only impact the dollars that we're getting here, but also what we're able to do in the future, or willing to do in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. As we've talked about, certainly the Urbanist has covered, Washington State had the most regressive taxation system in the country for years. Now we're just one of the worst. We're not literally the worst anymore. We may be the second worst. But this is talking about defunding our climate response, defunding the opportunity to make our cities more livable for everyone there at a time when just about every locality is struggling with some form of a budget deficit. And so it's going to have major ramifications. So making sure that you're engaged in these initiatives and encouraging people to pay attention and vote no on these initiatives certainly is, I think, what has been advocated for by several progressive organizations. But this is certainly something that we urge people to pay attention to and engage with. I do want to talk about, when it comes to the path forward, what are the most impactful ways that people can advocate for these bills? And in addition to that, or maybe including that, what should people be asking candidates for the legislature in their districts this year as these campaigns unfold through August and November? Ryan?
Yeah, I think, the most impactful way to advocate around the legislature is pretty constant contact with your own state representatives and senators. You may have one that's a little bit more responsive than others, but ultimately, that is the most impactful way in terms of of amplifying your voice. Obviously, paying attention to outlets like the Urbanist and others who are kind of trying to communicate when the key pressure points come up. But in terms of, there was a second part to your question, I think.
Yeah, looking at what should they be asking?
Oh yeah.
What are the most impactful ways they can engage, and what should they be asking candidates who are either running for the first time or running for reelection?
Yeah, I guess I will use this kind of to talk about, sort of a little bit of a new frontier in the legislature when it comes to the state government holding local governments accountable for their actions. This is just becoming a huge topic in terms of we see places like Kenmore saying no to deeply affordable supportive housing. We see places like Seattle, kind of shirking their responsibility to grow sustainably with its comprehensive plan. And so to me, this is like the big hot topic in terms of people running for office. What are you going to do to ensure that all levels of government are being responsive, adhering to sustainable, growth practices, and not sort of, shunting the burden off onto other jurisdictions. We saw Jessica Bateman had a really exciting bill that was introduced this session that I wasn't able to talk about yet, but basically would have, set up a framework that holds local governments accountable for their planning decisions directly at the state government. It's kind of unprecedented in terms of Washington, but it's been done in other cities. And it also includes a little bit of a stick in terms of taking away the ability to deny permits to buildings if they're not held in compliance. And so a little bit of an incentive for governments to actually kind of hew to a certain framework that they should already be applying to. But to me, this is like something that should absolutely be a massive issue during this year's campaign.
What do you think, Jazz?
Yeah, I think in addition to your own state reps, making sure that you're staying involved with the committee chairs and what's going on in each individual committee, even if you're not necessarily following specific bills or you don't really know where to start. Anything democracy related is going to be in the state government committee, and so knowing what they're talking about and what's going on is also a great place to start, similar to housing, transportation, and whatnot. Following the subject matter and staying in contact with the committee itself, whether that's sending in written testimony or testifying live via Zoom. They make it really easy these days, even if you can't get to Olympia, is going to be important to making sure that bills make it out of the committee. I know that there's been more than one bill where it's kind of been like, well, we need to have advocates talking about like why this is important, because otherwise it might look like this isn't a priority, or that this won't do anything, or that it's not worth the time that it takes to get out of committee. So ensuring that you're talking not just to your legislator, but to the committees themselves that'll keep the bill moving is important. And I think that in terms of questionnaires or endorsements or elections coming up, really holding people accountable for their votes and their comments and whatnot about your priorities. So going back to the people that you might have endorsed in previous elections and being like, hey, I thought we were cool, but you didn't support this bill. What happened, and how can I move you? Because this is what's really important to young people. This is really what's important to urbanists. And even if we don't have anyone running against someone, making sure that we're staying in conversation and that we're not letting the people that we like and support get a free pass just because there's not someone more aligned running.
Absolutely makes a big difference. So looking at how things may be teeing up for next session, how can bills like the transit-oriented development bill, rent stabilization maintain their momentum into the next session? Ryan?
Yeah, I think it's going to be different for these for each of these. I think something like rent stabilization. I think is a little bit more of a numbers game. Um, I think that we have some clear support for this bill from for a from the House side in terms of people who are heading over to the Senate, likely heading over to the Senate. Um, and so I think that is a little bit more of a clear path. Like I alluded to earlier on the transit development bill, I think you really have a little bit of a difference of opinion. And I know that people are going to be kind of trying to convince their colleagues, especially those that are coming over from the House to the Senate, in terms of the best path forward in terms of affordability floor. I could see the transit development bill passing, maybe if it was fairly modest, with a recommended, or maybe affordability mandate that cities are allowed to add on, but isn't an automatic imposition from the state. That would allow the mandates to be a little bit more locally calibrated. But if there's a blanket 10% affordability mandate, I'm just not sure I see a path forward in 2025, even after all these elections, because it's pretty polarizing, and and you're just empowering, like I said, that small group of lawmakers.
Anything to add on that, Jasmine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have a better opportunity with it being a budget year to move different things around. And I'm hopeful that once we make it through this election, then we have more bodies of support, but then also less excuses in certain senses. And so I remain hopeful. Always optimistic that we can at least keep asking for more.
That makes sense. So now going into the question and answer portion of this, we have gotten some questions from folks. So looking at some housing questions, one question about the co-housing bill. Does it permit more hostel style short-term lodging accommodation, or is it strictly residential?
So I tried to look at the answer to this one during the show live here, and my understanding after reading the bill is that it would not apply to places like that unless they're already in commercial zones.
And talking about the parking minimum bill, just looking at more details on what the parking minimum change applies to and how big of an impact you think it would have. So what changes does it actually make? And will it make a difference?
That was about the shoemake bill. So yeah, it doesn't actually change minimums. It just, like I said, allows more flexibility in terms of what kind of parking you allow. It does include that provision, though, like I mentioned, that lets you say that a tree prevention requires you from meeting a minimum requirement. It's to be interesting to see how that plays out in the actual implementation stage. How big the trees are. I'm kind of curious to see how that one actually goes through the local government sausage maker. But I think that it's like I said, there is definitely a small but mighty um, unlabeled parking caucus in the legislature that definitely wants to remove minimums, but the Association of Washington Cities and obviously, certainly a fairly sizable contingent of lawmakers as well don't want to see that move forward, want to keep that local retained. So this is kind of a little of an inroad while we maybe make more headway on that larger fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at some of the specifics, I think the characterization, that's right, is it doesn't impact the minimums, it applies more flexibility to them. And so parking spaces, basically garages and carports are not required as a way to meet parking minimums, which certainly saves on space, makes that space more buildable, basically. The parking spots can be enclosed or unenclosed. Parking spaces in tandem can count toward meeting the minimum parking requirements at a rate of 1 space for every 20 linear feet. So they don't have to be as segregated as they were before. Non-conforming gravel surfacing in existing designated parking areas may not be a reason for prohibiting the utilization of that space. So that is now an option for parking spaces. It may not be required to exceed 8 feet by 20 feet, except for required parking for people with disabilities. And also parking spaces that consist of grass block pavers may count towards minimum parking regulations. So it does go through, it allows more flexibility in what's currently there. And hopefully that makes a difference. What kind of impact do you think this is going to have, Ryan?
I think it's going to be at the margins. So I think, I think its biggest impact ultimately would be a messaging bill as well, saying we did this, the sky didn't fall. Your gold-plated city city requirements are not necessarily the be all and end all, and when it comes to requiring parking, and that you should kind of allow people to be more flexible, which is ultimately what abolishing parking minimums is all about. It's not about banning people from building parking. It's about allowing people to build the right amount for what they think they need.
I agree. And looking at a transportation related question, how do this year's bills mesh with the previous year's funding, like Move Ahead Washington? Can progress on density be made when so much funding is going towards highways?
It's a good two-parter. The first part is, how does it mesh with Move Ahead? So Move Ahead Washington, just to briefly explain, was sort of the last big transportation package. It included a bunch of new promises in terms of some highway projects. It included the CCA funded, Climate Commitment Act funded projects, as well as new sets of grants like the Fare Free for Kids transit, which was provided in exchange for money for operating costs for transit agencies. What we're seeing now is that the projects that we committed to 2 years ago are getting even more expensive. And so they're eating up more and more of the state transportation budget. We had a high profile instance where the last phase of the 520 bridge in North Capitol Hill in Seattle, came in $800 million over budget, over expected cost. And so they had to kind of find the money for that. The House originally proposed basically canceling the lid and pedestrian extension into Capitol Hill, which would be a game changer for Seattleites and the region as a whole. Thankfully, the Senate brokered a compromise and kept that in. But we're seeing the squeeze in terms of these mega projects, which I think gets into the second aspect of this question, which was, can progress on density be made when so much funding is going toward highways? It's a good question. I think yes. Obviously, we will continue to densify, but the question is sort of, are we making the best investments at the state level while we're still continuing to do these highway expansions? And I will note that sort of this, we have such a focus around transit-oriented density, areas like Redmond that are building around their Sound Transit stations, when Sound Transit is competing against WashDOT state highway funding for contracts, which basically causes the cost of those contracts to go up, because there's only a few companies that are able to do these huge transportation projects. And so we're actually kind of paying for the fact that we want to move forward on both these at the same time. And so I think, it deserves a look in terms of what our actual regional, state, and local priorities are, as opposed to trying this all of the above approach that we have going on right now.
Absolutely. Okay, looking at the next question. Regarding rent stabilization, what are your thoughts on whether there's just not sufficient support? How close is it to being passed? What races should be targeted? What arms can we twist for next time? Basically, what is the path and how can people help?
I mean, I think it's more arms than we think we can count. I think that while the house looks good, there's always room to get a stronger line of support and whatnot. And with so many supportive votes going to the Senate, making sure that we are doing that math and maintaining support within the House for rent stabilization. So there's no surprises if it gets kicked back the other way. But really going in depth on all the senators, like I was learning more and more about where people stood and who was getting in the way this session than I would have guessed. Like the start, there might have been like one or two senators that I like knew to expect, but with what happened in the housing committee, with it not making it through by Senator Cleveland's vote, then that was surprising, and that means that that's an area to have more conversations, to do more education on the actual impact of rent stabilization and what works. It also highlights that while we do have a little bit more room on the Senate to start filling spaces with supporters, that there's also people that we need to keep talking to and keep reaching out to and get those hard answers on when it push comes to shove and it's the last day of the Ways and Means Committee before fiscal cutoff. Is this going to be a priority, and are renters going to be a priority for our representatives and our senators? And if they are caring about the people that are in their communities getting priced out of their homes.
Absolutely. I will just add that it's also important to make sure that we support the people who are champions, because there is a well-funded opposition. There's a very established opposition. There are lots of lobbyists on the other side. And so part of making progress is maintaining the progress that we've already made and making sure that we don't lose those members, that they don't face very tough challenges, that it doesn't become attractive to target them. And in fact, the tide shifts in the other way. And just always making sure that as we continue to talk to each other and have events like this, that always we make contacting our elected officials and expressing your priorities and, hey, I really want to see this, a part of your advocacy, a regular part of it, because folks who disagree with these policies have been doing that for a long, long time. And there is still an assumption, I think, by a lot of people that this is just unpopular and people don't want this. But when we look at actual polling, people do, for the most part, for a lot of these things. These are a lot more popular than a lot of legislators assume. And some have already been surprised by that and have moderated their stances and changed their stances, but there are still some who feel like, oh, this isn't applicable to my district. It's only a city thing. It's not a suburban thing, all those kinds of things. And so just make sure that you're always letting them know directly, a phone call, an email, whatever. Let them know that you're a constituent and you care about this and you'll be paying attention. Looking at the next question, are there any specific organizations campaigning to mobilize the no vote to repeal the CCA, the Climate Commitment Act, and the capital gains excise tax? Yes. Go ahead, Jasmine.
Oh yeah, yes. A lot of folks are coming together, and while they are separate initiatives where they might have a couple of groups going this way and a couple of groups going that way to focus on where everyone's capacity works best and whatnot, that progressives are coming out against these initiatives, and that there will be an organized opposition. I think organizations to kind of start looking towards might be the Washington Conservation Action Organization on the Climate Commitment Act, and Invest in Washington Now on capital gains. Balance Our Tax Code has been working on capital gains as well, and really coming together and pulling up a united front to defend Washington. Northwest Progressive Institute is one of the organizations that's been pulling all the efforts together in a united front. And so, yeah, a lot of good folks working on this.
Yeah. And probably the biggest effort, you can, these are all, registered with the PDC, so you can look those up, but the Defend Washington 2024 effort, which is a joint effort. There are certainly organizations like Jasmine talked about working on them individually, jointly. The Defend Washington effort is probably the biggest and most coordinated that exists and that we're going to see. And so that we will see that. And also there's the, looking at that for there. And then for rent stabilization, there is the Washington Low Income Housing Alliance working on that, and also on the capital gains tax issue. So a lot of progressive Washington across the board is mobilizing to defend these, because this is a dire situation if it passes. Completely redoes what our government does effectively defund so much of what the state does and what we need done. Looking at the next question, with the Association of Washington Cities being largely hostile to urbanist priorities, are there cities having a more positive influence on the state legislature? And I'll ask that one, and then we'll save the other question for later. So what cities are having a more positive influence on the ledge?
I think this is a little tough question to answer. I think there are definitely cities that are more active at the legislature, commenting on bills in a positive direction. Kirkland comes to mind. Redmond, City of Seattle even is able to push on a lot of bills in a good direction. I think that the sticky issue is sort of when you have the big lobbying organization that is kind of purporting to speak for all cities, that it's very easy to get drowned out when you're a small city doing that. And so I think that the successful models have kind of been legislators who are kind of more in tune with their local governments directly. Obviously, we have in the first district up in Bothell, we have Rep. Davina Dewar, who was a Bothell City Council member for a while, doing both at the same time. So has a very, very intense knowledge of local governments and sort of how they work. Senator Liz Lovelit, the chair of the Senate Local Government Committee, was also an Anacortes City Council member. I think respect Liz Lovelit, but I think I will say that I think perhaps you're seeing more of the knowledge of the sort of unintended consequences side of local government, maybe the more gun shy aspects when it comes to wanting to go further at the legislature. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, but I think ultimately, the most successful ones are the ones who have been there and know how it works.
I'll just add to this. I think everything that Ryan said is absolutely valid. And I think that looking at local action that cities are taking makes what they're discussing in the legislature less scary, especially when it's outside of Seattle. That it's not, hey, it's just this big city urban thing. It's just common sense, land use, planning issues, development, transportation, things that are happening, which is why we can see a Republican from Walla Walla pass a bill unanimously on some of those issues. And the more of that happens locally, and we've seen, positive things happening when it does come to middle housing, to expanding where people can build, zoning issues in places like Tacoma, Spokane, Olympia, looking at transportation progress and walkability and mobility and Gig Harbor and Bothell, things like that. And that helps shift the conversation in the legislature. And I think that has been very helpful in this past session and getting the things to actually get to the threshold where it can pass the House. So we still have work to do to get through the Senate, but also making sure that these things happen locally, that they're implemented in local comprehensive plans, makes that lift less heavy when it gets to the legislature. Second part of that question was, how big of an impact will Seattle's comprehensive plan have on the state legislature?
I think it is definitely going to have an impact. It could be in a positive and a negative direction. I think we're seeing, when you have the state's biggest city basically saying, we're going to do the bare minimum, even less than the bare minimum, in terms of some of the provisions that are being floated right now to allow missing middle. It attracts attention, and it is going to basically prompt a very serious discussion about, raising that minimum at the state level, and actually, changing the framework that exists in a way that no one really maybe notice if a smaller city like Edmonds or something was going to do. And so I think, like I said before, we're seeing this kind of unprecedented momentum behind preemption and accountability of local governments. And so I think this is going to ramp that up in terms of kind of scrutiny that the legislature is going to be applying to the entire framework and not just the aspects that only impact Seattle. On the other side, I think, Seattle's behavior is going to also kind of turn into a little bit of a, well, if Seattle's doing this, then I can get away with it too. And so I think you might see a little bit of that in some of the cities that we did expect to kind of do the bare minimum when it came to implementing the missing middle bill, for example, cities that haven't traditionally been welcoming to a lot of growth. And so I think I can see that kind of pulling in both directions.
Well, thank you very much for that. That concludes our question and answer. And with that, this event comes to a close. I want to thank our panelists, Ryan Packer and Jazmine Smith, for their insight and making this an engaging and informative event. Special thanks to the Urbanist Board's events team, Jesse Swingle, Sarah Mills, and Ruth Lipscomb, for helping to plan and put on this event. Thank you so much. Not possible without you. To those watching on Zoom, thank you for joining us. If you missed any of the discussion tonight, you can catch up on theurbanist.org, and be sure to follow us on social media and join our all ages monthly meetups at Stroop Brewing Capitol Hill every third Thursday from 5:30 to 7 p.m. We encourage you to stay engaged and hope you have a wonderful evening.